We've moved into the realms of an aspect of ancient alchemy. There appears to be a direct correlation between the sacred gemstone that contained the tables of testimony, that was passed to Moses and eventually fell to King Solomon, and a previous gemstone of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, which came to be called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. The content of the Emerald Tablet is very largely available still today. A lot of people don't realize it, but it is. And it begins by saying, "By this knowledge thou wilt partake of the honors of the whole world. By this knowledge the darkness will fly from thee. With this knowledge thou wilt be able to overcome all things." This was determined to be all that man had ever known and a good amount of all that man would ever know. Now, according to the records of the ancient dragon court of Egypt, which was founded by Queen Shebek-Nefru in 1785 BC, the early guardian of the table of testimony, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, was a character called Kem. Kem was the high priest of Mendez. The word Kem, or Kam, means blackness. And it was from the root of Kem, or Kam, came the word alchemy, out of the blackness, or the blackness. To us, Kem is better known, high priest of Mendez, as the biblical character Ham. Ham, we are told, was the grandfather of Nimrod, whose family were cursed by the Hebrews because his tradition was in historical conflict with the emergent Jehovah-based culture. And readers of Gothic novels and books about sorcery will, of course, recognize the name Kem of Mendes. He's often symbolized by a goat. This was precisely the emblem of Ham. The coat of arms of Ham was used in sovereign genealogies right through until the 1700s. Every male of that dynasty was given the same coat of arms. In Christian law, as against sovereign law, the goat has become a symbol of the devil. What we now discover is that by following the story of Kem of Mendes, it leads us directly to the Sinai temple, the white powder of gold, and back into the starfire ritual of the early civilizations, which I talked about here last October. Mendes was a major city of the Egyptian Delta. Kem was designated not only as high priest, but as the archon of the 10th age of Capricorn. It was this Capricorn imagery which gave him the symbol of the goat. The emblem of Kem of Mendes is interesting. The emblem of Kem of Mendes was a pentagram, a 5-pointed star. But it was an inverted pentagram. It had two uppermost points. And the two uppermost points were the horns of the goat of Mendes. The two downward sloping side points were the ears, and the single base point was the chin and the beard of the goat of Mendes. Now, when a pentagram is seen in this inverted position, it is a wholly male emblem. But the pentagram star is, of course, a female symbol. And the female device is usually shown the other way around. It's a Venus emblem, which has the single point at the top. In the pentagram's male position, with the two uppermost points, Kem is particularly identified in sovereign genealogy by an emerald jewel, which is set exactly in the middle of those 2 points, in the forehead at the meeting of the horns. But when turned about, the pentagram achieves its Venus female status. The uppermost point now becomes the head of the goddess. The ears once downward pointing are now upright and become arms, and the once horns are the legs of the goddess. Quite suddenly, the emerald jewel, now a Venus, is established not in the forehead, but in a vulval position. This, interestingly, I just discovered it a few weeks ago, is precisely the symbolism that David Wood, in his book Poussin's Secret, came up with in the geometry of Rennes-le-Château. In fact, while I'm on this, I'll mention something. I watched my video from this time last year, and somebody asked me about Rennes-le-Château and the investigations, and I listened to my response, and it sounded a bit dismissive. I didn't mean it to be. What I really wanted to say was that I wasn't going to personally forge a route down cartography and geometry that other people were light years ahead of me on. I would leave it to them, and I made the point that there are loads of people doing this, and I made it sound not important, and in actual fact that wasn't what I meant, just meant that it wasn't what I'm about. I've had letters since then from people saying, apart from that, who of all the writers about Rennes-le-Château do you find writes material that is the closest to the bloodline of the Holy Grail material that I came up with? And I have to say I've studied it particularly because of that question, and ultimately David Wood's is the writings which are closest to that. Within the male pentagram figure with the jewel set in the forehead, one finds often in imagery fire, flames coming from this jewel. Now, these flames are called astral light, enlightenment, great knowledge, great wisdom, great truth. When it's turned the other way up into the goddess position, the flames are called starfire. Now, from the very beginning of time, documented time, whether astral light or starfire, the pentagram was associated with a pre-Jewish ritual called the Sabbath. Chem of Mendez was always called the sabbatical goat. When one entered the temples of Chem of Mendez to train under the great masters and the Vulcans of the period, one was said to be diversifying from normal occupation and toil to take a sabbatical. And it's from precisely that we get the term sabbatical in academic circles today. It comes out of ancient Egypt. It is for no chance reason that artists such as Albert Dürer, in their portrayals of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, have center stage in their pictures not a serpent, but a goat. So in view of this, it's hardly surprising that the pentagram and the sabbatical goat became particularly associated with heterodox Christianity. People like the Cathars of Languedoc in the Middle Ages. But in contrast, the Orthodox Christian Church endeavored to overawe the whole of this old wisdom of the mystery schools, and they created a hybrid religion which was based on not knowing the secrets, not on learning the unknown, but on suppressing the unknown and suppressing it all. So as an outcome, the goat of Mendez became identified in the Middle Ages, the time of the Inquisition, with black magic, with witchcraft, with sorcery, and with everything that we were supposed to have nothing to do. Even now, the goat of Mendez comes up in this sort of portrayal. We see it all the time in films, in books by authors like Dennis Wheatley. You know, it's always the goat figure, and these books are bound with stories of holy water and crucifixes and things which can destroy the goat. This is really a story based on how to destroy the wisdom, how to destroy the learning, how to make sure that people are subjugated by the rule of the bishops, by church interpretation of the Bible texts. Ham, Chem, is given in the Old Testament as a son of Noah. But in the oldest historical records, pre-Bible writing times, this is not the case at all. He, along with his brother Japhet, were the sons of the great Vulcan and goldsmith Tubal-Cain, who is better known to Sumerologists, and in fact Alan Alford might mention this as Mescalam Du, king and hero of the good land. In the early days of Palestine, Chem of Mendez was associated with a certain Azazel, a goat figure, Azazel of Capricorn. Now, according to the book of Enoch, Azazel was highly important. He's described as an angel or a watcher or whatever, but it is said that Chem Azazel made known to all men the use of metals, the art of working them, and the great secrets of the use of antimony. Antimony is element number 51. It's known these days as stibium. It's an essential ingredient of the preparatory alchemical process when producing the Philosopher's Stone. In the ancient Arab world, antimony was called kohl, K-O-H-L, from which derives our word today. Kohl means something which is black. The related word alcohol stems from exactly the same source. It's Arabic, al-kohol, the highly refined philosophical mercury prepared from spirits of wine rectified over antimony, that which is black. From the same root comes the name of Kali, the goddess of seasons, of periods and cycles. And the periodic time frame of Kali's own monthly cycle was called the Kala. And from this we derive the word calendar. In the Hebrew tradition of Bath Kol, a Kali counterpart, Bath Kol was called the daughter of the voice. And the voice of wisdom was the logos, or the word, and it was said to emanate from the womb. And hence the womb was itself designated in times way, way back as the utterer of the word, the utterer or uterus. Now, Azazel of Capricorn, this goat figure, actually appears in the Old Testament, but not in the authorized English version that we have today. In the Vulgate book of Leviticus, there's a reference to the custom of atonement, the early Hebrew custom of atonement, and it is said that Aaron shall cast lots upon two goats, one for the Lord and the other for Azazel. That which fell to the lot of the Lord, Jehovah, was to be sacrificed as a sin offering, and the other which fell to the lot of Azazel was to be sent into the wilderness as an atonement. Now, in the English translation, the word Azazel has been missed out altogether and supplanted by the word scapegoat. We still have the word goat there, it's a scapegoat. And the reason for this was very plain, that in the original sequence of that particular atonement custom, it was very, very clear that lots were drawn, bets were made, and offerings were made not just to Jehovah by the Hebrews, but to Chem Azazel, the goat of Mendez, as well. The book of Enoch draws readers' attention to this, making Azazel a very important character and linking him all the time to Hermetic alchemy. In the tradition of the Rosicrucian adepts of the early mystery schools, the writing of Chem was recorded as being the most ancient monument of the Chaldeans concerning the Philosopher's Stone. This was associated with the wisdom of Thoth, with the emerald tablets. He was called Hermes by the Greeks, and the whole thing was defined as Hermetic. They were Hermetic teachings. Alchemy became Hermetic. They were to do with Thoth, and Thoth was Chem. Even the name Hermes itself derives from the word Herma. Herma is related in old texts always to the building of pyramids. And the word Herma simply means a contrived pile of stones. So Hermes, Thoth, and the teachings of Thoth, the alchemical Hermetic teachings, are all to do, once again, with pyramid building. So how did the Egyptians know about the manufacture of the highwood firestone? This was a Mesopotamian thing before it was Egyptian. What was it, and how was it associated with Venus, with the pentagram, with the starfire? And the starfire was determined as the elixir, the lunar essence, the monthly essence of the goddess. So to answer this, we've got to get back to where I was last October and travel back in time from ancient Egypt, back into ancient Mesopotamia, the era and the place where the whole of earthly kingship began. The interesting thing about early kingship, even in the original Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, not the ones that we have translated, but the earliest Hebrew ones that we have to hand, is that the early kings of the line from Eve's son Cain were called the Earthling Kings. The word Adam, Adama, meant earthling, and they were called the Adama. So we get back into the land of Adam, we get back into ancient Mesopotamia, we get back into the place where the earliest cities and modern type styles of civilization began. And we suddenly find in ancient Shuma, southern Mesopotamia, by the Persian Gulf, that the gods of Canaan and the Hebrews, who were called the Elohim, are suddenly called the Anunnaki. The same people, the same names, the same stories. They were called the Anunnaki. And they were said to meet in assembly regularly at Nippur under the presidency of the great Lord of the Sky, the chief of the gods, who was called Anu. And strangely, in Psalm 82, if you look it up in the Bible, you will actually see a reference to Jehovah having to go and present himself before the great court of this assembly. It was from Anu, who determined, it was said, the course of the year and its seasons, that we derive our present word annum. Annum for year, per annum. Comes from Anu. It's not a Latin word, it's much, much older than that. His two sons were Enki and Enlil, and their sister was Nin-Hersag, who was called the Lady of Life. Another prominent female Anunnaki goddess was Ereshkigal, the queen of the netherworld, and her daughter was Lilith, who you probably all heard of. Other key males of the pantheon were people like Marduk and Ninurta and Nergal, king of the netherworld. Now, the netherworld is an interesting thing. Writers will have us believe that the netherworld was some sort of beneath the earth domain, some underground world. It wasn't at all. The netherworld was clearly just the depiction of the earthly kingdom as against the heavenly kingdom. So this is the netherworld we're in now. The ancient king list of Sumer now dates back more than 4,000 years. The list of all the kings that reigned in that part of the world at that time. But it was only translated 60 years ago in the 1930s. It details one by one the kings of that old region from the time when it first began, and it opens with the words, "Now kingship was lowered by the Anunnaki from heaven." After some length of time, the list mentions that the kingly race and its people were beset by a great flood. It tells the story of this flood in great detail. It doesn't tie up with the time of Noah, as the Bible has it, but the story is the same. The kings of Sumer were the origin of the bloodline that produced the Pharaohs of Egypt. The Pharaohs of Egypt were the bloodline that produced King David, King Solomon, and the kings of Israel. Despite everything that biblical history tells us, there is nothing on historical record anywhere that makes any importance of the fact that David and Solomon, or Jesus, were descended from Abraham, or Noah, or Adam. That was not their importance at all. Their importance was that they were of the Egyptian pharaonic line, which came from old Mesopotamia. They were called the Adama. They were called the Earthling Kings. They emerged in about 3,800 BC, and in essence, it's their story that the beginning of Genesis attempts to tell us. And the story outside of the Bible begins with a fellow called Priest King Attaba and his wife Ninava. And they're better known to us, of course, as Adam and Eve. Attaba of the father, Ava, Eve. Clay tablets and cylinder seals explain that around 6,000 years ago, Attaba and Ava, Adam and Eve, were purpose-bred for kingship at a place called the House of Shimty. Shimty was described in modern language as a clinical center of genetic engineering. The name Shimty comes from Sumerian, Shi-im-ti, breath, wind, life. Ninti, Lady of Life, was the title of Enki's sister Nin-Hersag. And it's interesting to note that this title is also given to Eve in the Bible. She becomes the Lady of Life, the mother of all living. Ti means life. But there's another word in Sumerian that was spelt almost the same except for a little accent. And the word wasn't ti, it was pronounced ti. Ti, a long word, ti and ti. Now to the Hebrews, ti meant rib. So the Lady of Life becomes also in the Bible story the Lady of the Rib. And we have this story about how she must have been contrived from Adam's rib. Has nothing to do with any early records at all. This stuff was contrived not even in the early Hebrew documents, but in the times of translation. They found this word, it meant rib. Genesis makes a lot of errors. The point that it fails time and time again to recognize is that kingship was wholly matrilinear. Even when one comes into Britain in the times of the Dark Ages and King Arthur and even after that, the rule was very specific. A king can only be a king if he has a queen, and the queen must be of the royal bloodline. So it was the queens that were important, always, the queens of the line. And the reason for that was that it was the female line that always carried the mitochondrial DNA that was so important to be passed to the offspring. Fathers did not produce this DNA. But what the Jews writing the Bible were trying to do was to create a patriarchal dynasty, a dynasty of males that led down to David and Solomon and Jesus. So this reasoning, this law had to disappear. And they contrived a line from Adam and Eve's son, Seth. Whereas in actual fact, all the early documents tell us that the kingly line, the line that held the mitochondrial DNA in its strain and went into Egypt and came back out again, was not the line from Seth at all. It was the line from Cain, the first son. Cain, the fellow who was supposed to have murdered his brother and who we should all treat with suspicion. Why do we treat him with suspicion? Because in learning too much about Cain, we learn too much about truth. The line is detailed in great, great depth in Sumerian and Egyptian history. It was overshadowed in the Bible because they were trying to create a patriarchal line and not a matriarchal line. According to the archives of the Dragon Court of Egypt, the very roots of the distinctions king and queen both derive from the name Cain. Kingship and queenship were identical in essence. They were both Cainship. The sovereign line of the blood relatives, from which also comes the word kinship. Kinship, queenship, Cainship, they're all the same. It means nothing more than blood relative. And that was the importance of the line, that they were all blood relatives. So where does Adam feature in this? Because Adam's the key figure in the Bible, isn't he? He's the man that sort of started it all. Yes, he was the earthly husband of Eve, and he was the first priest king of a particular type, but he wasn't the beginner of the bloodline. The first king of the bloodline was Cain, so where did Cain come from? Well, if one reads even in the modern Bible translations, and certainly in the old Bible translations, Eve actually says to Adam, surprise, surprise, I've begotten me a man from the Lord. This is not Adam's son. The Jewish archives and all of the early archives tell us that the father of Cain was somebody called the Lord. The Bible tells us that Cain was a tiller of the ground. That's really interesting because in translation I found all sorts of things that have got misconstrued. This is a brilliant example of it. A straight translation from what the original text says is not Cain was a tiller of the ground, but Cain had dominion over the earth. That's kind of different, isn't it? Cain, the Sumerian records tell us, and the Hebrew records tell us, was born by a father who the Hebrews call Samael, and who the Sumerian records call Enki, one of the Anunnaki, and he was called the Lord of Samael simply because he was the Lord of Samael. That was a city in Syria at the time. So the Hebrews called him Samael, and Samael has a sort of Satan connotation these days, but it didn't. It was simply the name of a city, and he was in charge of it in those times. So Cain we have as a character whose blood is really heightened. His father is pure Anunnaki. His mother is half-bred Anunnaki, and from her comes the gene. And we get back to exactly what Jay-Z mentioned earlier. Who the hell did he marry? Because this is the guy who the Bible tells us had a wife and had a series of sons, important sons and descendants, called Enoch, Tubal-Cain, Lamech, and others who we learn lots about, but whose story in Genesis just suddenly disappears and gets taken over by stories of Noah and people like that. This family was the key to the royal bloodline. They were the great Vulcans, they were the kings, and they were the most heightened clones, as they called them at the time. Clones. We call it clones now. The word didn't have an E in it. It was clones. Clon meant twig. They were the most important twigs, or as we might say, branches of something they called the vine. They were the clones of the vine. The vine, of course, was the Grail. The Grail was the bloodline. According to not just Mesopotamian texts, but even Hebrew texts of the period say, not that Cain slew Abel and spilled his blood on the ground. What they say is, Cain's blood was so advanced that in relation to his brother Hevel, his brother's blood was earthbound by comparison. Cain, it was said in the old scriptures, rose far above Abel. What we have in our modern text is Cain rose up against Abel. It's not the same thing at all. It was making the point that his line was supreme, it was superior, it was the purposefully bred, cloned, branched, kingly line, which was the first clue I got when I started out on the second book to answer the question, yes, the bloodline of the Holy Grail is important, but what was so special about the bloodline in the first place? What was so special about it was that it was purpose-bred to be the Adama, the earthling leaders of mankind, whom the early texts call Lulu, which again was contrived, a hybrid line. The Anunnaki knew that they were not going to be around forever running and building these cities. They knew that mankind would have to take care of his own destiny and have his own governors. So the best they could do for him was to produce this race of kingly beings, and that their bloodline was heightened to an enormous degree that they were almost like gods themselves. They had a feeding process which they called the Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life. And if you remember the phrase in Genesis, where Adam actually took from the fruit of the tree, Jehovah actually said to the other gods, Genesis says this, behold, the man has become like one of us. He has become almost like a god himself. And that was the root of the kingly line. It was bred to be almost like gods. And this was what perpetuated into Egypt with the pharaohs. These people were bred and fed and perpetuated in a dimension which was above the norm in terms of awareness and consciousness, general understandings and abilities. So who was Cain married to? By the law of things, Cain would have to be married to his half-sister. That was the rule. It was a rule that the pharaohs perpetuated, and it applied in Sumer, in Mesopotamia. And lo and behold, when we read the text, that's exactly what we discover. So to answer Jay-Z's question, the wife of Cain was a woman called Lulava. Lulava was the daughter of Enki. Lulava's mother was Lilith of the netherworld. She was pure-bred Anunnaki. So not only was Cain himself of heightened Anunnaki stock, his wife is then pretty well pure Anunnaki, and they're now going to have their next son. So the bloodline is heightened again. The Bible doesn't actually give us the name of Lulavar, but lots of other texts do, including Hebrew texts. It does name, of course, his younger son Enoch. Now, Enoch's pretty important because Enoch and the writings of Enoch are from where we learn a lot of our knowledge about early alchemy and how important it was. There was a problem with Enoch because this knowledge and all these writings came out of the line from Cain. So another line was contrived from a son called Seth, and within that son called Seth, virtually name by name, the same characters and sons, one after the other, are listed down to a fellow called Enoch. Never existed in history. Enoch, who wrote those papers, was of the line of Cain. The line of kings was defined as the branches, as the clones, or as the twigs of the vine, and the branches and twigs of the vine are exactly what perpetuated into the Middle Ages, Grail law, and all the things that I wrote about in the other book. It is still there today. The vine is the cup, is the Grail. In all aspects of their contrived breeding, this kingly line was superior to the normal human race. Physically and mentally, and in terms of its longevity, was immensely superior. They lived for a long, long time. It was recognized at the time, although they probably didn't call it the same thing, that the important aspect of breeding this bloodline was the gene that came from the female. They didn't quite know what to call it. They knew the word gene then, because the word gene simply relates to a continuing process. They linked it to Isis, the great mother god of the whole. You know, there were lots of gods and goddesses, but this all-embracing figure was Isis in ancient Egypt, and they linked it to that, and they called it the gene Isis, from whence comes Genesis, the beginning. So from 3200 BC, we suddenly start to learn about this feeding process. We learn about something called the plant of life, or the tree of life. And the more we look, the more we find exactly what this plant of life was, and suddenly it becomes called starfire. Starfire now suddenly relates to the Egyptian pentagram and to the Venus figure. Starfire. I guess there are some of you who were here in October when I spoke about starfire before, but I'll just cover it a little bit. Starfire in Jewish circles became something which they were taught to avoid like the plague. Starfire belonged to this other line. This belonged to the senior kingly line. This is a line of important superior beings, and Jehovah wants us to have nothing to do with that. We are supposed to be subordinate subjects. We must not take the starfire. Starfire was related to blood, and hence the dictate was made that Jews should avoid the ingestion of blood. It applies even today, and it applied from way, way back, and it's the reason why even now meat is hung to get rid of the blood before it's ingested. Strangely enough, in the Christian world, exactly the opposite happens. Not just that we eat blood and we eat meat and things, but we purposely make a ritual out of drinking blood. In the communion or mass sacrament, we take the Grail chalice, which is filled with the blood of the Messianic line, the blood of Jesus. We know that that's what the wine represents. We know that the wine is the fruit of the vine, and we know that the vine was this bloodline. We are ingesting figuratively the blood of this bloodline, which the Jews cannot do. So, how old is this chalice and wine ritual? How far does it go back to the point where actually it was a chalice of real blood? Well, it goes back a very, very long way. It goes out of Egypt, it goes back into ancient Sumer, and we discover that even then, the aspect of the chalice was all important. When this ritual was performed, the chalice represented the womb, exactly as I said in Bloodline of the Holy Grail. This is a female symbol that goes back to 3,500 BC. The chalice was as important as what it contained. The practice revolved around purely and simply feeding this line of kings with the menstrual blood of the Anunnaki goddesses. It's not surprising that we see references to this in medieval and even later 16th and 17th century Rosicrucian archives. It's the reason why people trying to attack and have a go at groups like the Rosicrucians or the early Knights Templar always have this thing about, oh, these are people who drink blood from skulls and that sort of thing. Well, clearly they don't, and they haven't done for the longest time, but this is where it goes back to. The importance of it was that even in 3000 odd BC, they recognized that this menstruum contained the most versatile elements of the human body, hormones. Hormones that were geared to do certain jobs within the body. You could heighten your hormonal status by taking this stuff. It seems a little bit, I don't know, it doesn't seem very nice, does it? But in fact, today, just to put it into perspective, we take all sorts of strange bodily supplements and things. The Premarin hormone that we take today comes from the urine of pregnant mares. Growth hormones and insulin can be manufactured from E. coli, which is a human fecal bacteria. So we actually ingest some pretty horrid stuff today without thinking too much about it, because it's called medicine. Well, they were doing exactly that then. The importance of it was that it was not human starfire. It was Anunnaki starfire. It was used to heighten the bloodline with even more Anunnaki food substance. The same substance that they would have been fed on before they were born, they continue to be fed on during life. The most prominent secretions that they got from the starfire were the hormones melatonin and serotonin. It is rife with them. These are the secretions of the pineal and pituitary glands, which you clearly know. The Greeks also had a version of this in later times, which they gained from priestesses that were specially bred for the purpose, and they called this nectar of supreme excellence ambrosia. And that's where the word ambrosia comes from. It's the same thing. It's starfire from priestesses and goddesses. They called it sometimes soma, S-O-M-A. Life-giving. So we have these Anunnaki goddesses who are mothers, and they're also virgins, and they have a lot of titles and names, but in essence their job was to provide the starfire to feed the kingly line. They were designated flowers. They were the flowers, and they were defined generally by the symbol of a lily or a lotus flower. And the word flower comes exactly from that root. It comes from the godly flowers. Now it's interesting, if you remember what I said earlier, that most of the laboratory equipment that they found in the Sinai temple, the vases and bowls and all of that, were all shaped like lilies and lotus flowers. But exactly this reason. Am I turning off? No. That's it. So the flower, she who flows, they were called lilies, and they were given names, and we find it in Anunnaki documentation, an ancient Sumerian record all the time. The characters were called Lily. They were called Lulava, the wife of Cain. They were called Lilith. They were called Lilutu. They were called Lilith. All of these names determined that these were Anunnaki flowers, producers of the starfire. So, I mean, most of you know about the functions of the pineal and pituitary glands, but in fact, the records of ancient Sumer tell us that they perfected a ramifying medical science of living substances to feed this line. And starfire was the essential source ingredient. It was called the gold of the gods. It was fed only to the kings and the queens of the royal succession. It was also called the vehicle of light, being the ultimate source of manifestation. And in this regard, it was equated with the waters of creation. So suddenly, light, waters, all of these words are all coming in, and these are the emblems that we find in the Sinai temple. Light, water, bread, all of this stuff. It all comes back to starfire origin, feeding the pharaohs, feeding the kings, feeding the bloodline. And it was for this reason that the original emblem of Cain, the mark of Cain that was placed on him, was not a curse. It was actually a coat of arms. The oldest recorded grant of arms in sovereign history in the world was a red cross within a circle. It was called the Mark of Cain, the emblem of the kingly line, and it was also called the Cup of the Waters. The Cup of the Waters, when translated later into a sort of Greco-Roman, was Rosae Crucis. And from Rosae Crucis, of course, come the Rosicrucians and everything associated with knowledge of this practice. This was the knowledge that the early Rosicrucians held. They held the knowledge of the Cup of the Waters. The cup was the chalice, the waters was the blood. This is exactly the same symbolism that we have in the Christian church today, except that we've forgotten what it was all about. Starfire recipients were considered to be qualified for kingship when they reached a predetermined state of enlightenment, of consciousness, a state when aptitudes and wisdom had reached particular levels. And they called the level of this the Malku, the Malku. It's interesting that even in the Bible, we find characters, kingly characters, and their names are always Malchus. Malchus simply means king, and it comes from exactly that root. It came from the Starfire practice, the achievement of the level of the Malku. But the Anunnaki departed. Exactly to the year it can be calculated from the documents, because they were all written at the same time. In 1960 BC, the Anunnaki left. No more Starfire. But they'd made provision. They had trained from the very beginning, from 3005, 7, 800 BC, a group of people called master craftsmen, Vulcans. These people were metallurgists. They worked with metals, but they were trained to take over the feeding process when the Anunnaki went and the Starfire existed no longer. For a while, they used specially bred priestesses to perform the Starfire function while the changeover was happening. These priestesses were called Scarlet Women. It's not surprising why. That's what they were called, Scarlet Women. They performed a ceremony called the Ritu, R-I-T-U, Ritu. And this Ritu was the extracting of the secretions from the Scarlet Women. And it's from the words Ritu that we get our modern word ritual, and from secretions that we get our modern word secret. The secret ritual was the Ritu of the secretions. And these were all parts of the old knowledge that the mystery schools taught. These are some of the secrets that Freemasonry says are lost, but they're not lost at all. Scarlet women, to the Greeks, were called hierodulae. Sacred women. Sacred women. If you translate hierodulae into French, into medieval French, and then directly from that into English, you get the word harlot. The Scarlet Women, the hierodulae of the Greeks, in parts of Western Europe and Germany, were called beloved ones. The language of the time, beloved ones, was hores, H-O-R-E-S, hores. And that, when anglicized, becomes whores. So suddenly, Scarlet Women, whores, harlots, all stem via a Christianized translation and interpretation of this old priestess culture as being something which can be identified, say, with prostitutes or adulteresses. That wasn't the case at all. These were sacred Scarlet Women. They produced the Starfire. Anyway, what happened was that they had to find a substitute. They had to find a way to keep the kingly line going, a way to keep these high melatonin and serotonin levels in the race without the Starfire to feed them. They used priestesses for a while. Even in Rome, they perpetuated it with the Vestal Virgins and whatever, but it got weaker and weaker and weaker. So in the meantime, enter the great metallurgists, the master craftsmen, the Vulcans. These were the people that knew about the teachings of Thoth, that knew about the emerald tablets, that had learnt all of the wisdom of how to produce the Starfire substitute. And that was what was going on at the Mountain Temple in Sinai. The logic is very simple. If you take a supplement that is in essence pure hormone, it increases your bodily level of those hormones. But by necessity, they are foreign to you. They've been taken from the priestess or the goddess or whatever. They're foreign hormones. Would it not be better, would it perhaps make sense, if you had a substance that you could be fed, which actually increased your own personal production of these hormones? You weren't taking the hormones directly, but you were taking something which made them go flinging into action, and you produced tons of it. Well, what they discovered was that this could be done. And this could be done with the sacred Shemana, the highwood firestone, the white powder, which was alchemically produced from gold and platinum group metals. Alchemy, the wisdom of Chem, alchemy. Chem was Ham. Chem was the devil to the Christians, but he was the great upholder of the starfire tradition to the early kingship. From the time of the earliest kingdoms in Samaria, kings were always called dragons, queens were always called dragons, and sometimes there were great kings or great queens that would be lording it over groups of others, and they were called great dragons. Now that perpetuated even into Dark Ages Britain, and great dragon translated is Pendragon, and that's where the Pendragons of Arthurian lore come in. These are the great kings. These are the ultimate kings of that succession who control all other kingdoms. It's interesting to learn that most of what we think is lost wisdom and lost knowledge is not lost at all. As I've discovered in the last year, many of these mystery schools still prevail from the time of ancient Egypt, and they're still held within certain royal houses. The Dragon Court itself was founded by Queen Shebek-Nefru back in 1800 roughly BC. That court still exists today. It's been through a number of changes, and it was essentially the court that most historians know about today was the version of it that was refounded in Hungary in 1408. And it was founded by Emperor Sigismund of Hungary. Now, he was a direct descendant of the kings of Jerusalem, so he didn't reinvent the Dragon Order. He inherited it through his family line. It had always been there, and he drew up a pact with nobles and princes of the line to protect the true sovereignty of the Grail Dragon bloodline from the Anunnaki. He drew up a document at the time, and it said that you will, as members of this order, be able to display the Ouroboros dragon with the red cross. That is the mark of Cain. Circular dragon, biting its own tail with the red cross in the center. That was the emblem of the Rosicrucis. We have perpetuated within the royal lines from 3000 odd BC to 1408 BC, a continuation of exactly this dynasty, and they were heavy into alchemy. They knew about the white powder, they knew about the feeding process. It's odd that Sigismund of Hungary, when he was made Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, was allowed to keep this order going, because in actual fact it was a pre-Christian Grail order that was everything that the church despised. But there was nothing that church could do about it, because this thing was bigger and older than they were, and they weren't about to upset 50% of the ruling houses of Europe. What they did was to bring in laws and regulations that began to make the court look as if it was about something that we didn't ought to be a part of. They linked it with Arthurian lore. They linked it with Grail romance. They even, in 1545 at the Council of Trent, blacklisted for all time the heretical writings of Merlin. Now, the heretical writings of Merlin were in essence about starfire practice and the white powder of gold. Everything that was fresh air to people, everything that was magic to people's ears, suddenly was made sinister, occult, blacklisted, was heresy, was condemned, and it was all called witchcraft. Enter, once again, Chem of Mendez, and they brought back the goat. The Christian church brought back this goat as the ultimate symbol. And from that moment on, holy water, crucifixes, bits of garlic, and all sorts of things were what you had to carry around with you to deal with these emissaries of the goat of Mendes and Satan. Melatonin was of particular importance in the dragon court of Sigismund. And it prompted a particular assault from the church at that time, because one of the members of that original court was Count Dracula. Count Dracula is better known to historians as Vlad III of Wallachia. He built the city of Bucharest. Dracula means son of Dracul. Within the order, his father was the Grand Master beneath the Sovereign Master, and the Grand Master was always called Dracul. There is a Dracul today. He was Dracula. He was the son of Dracul. Vlad, Count Dracula, was written down in history as a rather vicious sort of person. In fact, he was a great king of his country, but he had a special method of dealing with crimes against the state. In Wallachia, his form of execution was impaling people on wooden stakes. Now, actually, this was quite compatible with other punishments of the time. People then were boiled in oil or burnt at the stake. You know, it was even the Catholic inquisitors, the Dominican friars of the period, used to spread the victims with fat and roast them slowly from the feet upwards over fires. So what Vlad was doing was nothing unusual for the time. It's horrid today, but from then it was pretty awful. But the real fear of Vlad Dracula had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact, and his family records are incredible here, his knowledge of the ancient starfire customs and the white powder chemistry was immense. He actually had perfected for himself a way of staying young for a very long time. He had attended in Hermannstadt in Austria the School of Solomon. This was a school set up for the great kings of the line. Dracula attended that. He had a scientific understanding of the bodily effects of these hormones, of serotonin, of melatonin. He knew that they enhanced longevity. He knew that they increased consciousness. So all of these attributes were there, along with his knowledge of starfire. And it was from that that the church bore the Transylvanian myth. In Bram Stoker's novel, published in 1897, the starfire customs, the melatonin, and all of that suddenly comes into play, even the impaling on wooden stakes, but that's reversed against him. Dracula is suddenly a vampire, a prince of darkness, a melos tossos, melatonin, who imbibed the blood of virgins, the starfire, and the only way you can kill this man is to impale him with a wooden stake. So it's interesting, isn't it, that even these stories that produce amazing folklore and fairy tale are based not just upon a fact of history, but on a fact of history which has been designed by church establishments and governments to suppress all of our knowledge of this ancient starfire and white powder practice. Anybody involved with it is not suddenly now a witch, but a vampire. Hence my comments at the beginning of this talk this evening. A lot of early folklore, in fact, comes from the same sort of roots. It's all bloodline-based. Fairies. Fairies are born from a dragon and grail tradition. The very concept of the fairies, the fair folk, comes from fae or fee. It relates to fate. It relates to the fate of the Grail bloodline. Royal families of Celtic Europe were all said to carry fairy blood. That's why. In those times, in medieval Europe, the word fairy was in fact Ilbe, Y-L-B-E, or in fact even Albi, A-L-B-E, or in fact even Elbe, E-L-B-E. It all meant elven, fairy Grail bloodline. When the Pope launched his 1208 campaign into the Languedoc, it was called the Albi Jensen Crusade. They had named one of their cities Albi, these people, Elvin. Albi Gens was the Elvin blood. The crusade was actually launched against the Albi Jensens, the supporters of the Elvin blood, the fairy folk. This is Grail bloodline stuff. The whole of that Inquisition was set against the Grail bloodline to suppress it and to suppress people's knowledge of it. This stuff is still prominent today because people are still writing books about witchcraft and sorcery. And it's interesting that gold always plays an important part. The dragon somewhere is always guarding the pile of gold. Look in the children's books. There's usually in a cave and there's a pile of gold and the dragon guards it. This is the gold of the Starfire substitute. The dragon is the bloodline, and this is the great secret being guarded by the dragon. Gold was always a symbol of kingship. Pine resin, which was associated with pineal secretion, pineal gland secretion, was used to make frankincense. Frankincense and gold were traditionally emblems of kingship in the royal bloodline. They were also linked up with myrrh, which was a gum resin used as a sedative, which was representative in the line of death. Tomb and womb were absolutely synonymous in the language of the Grail. Tomb and womb are both roots to the knowledge. They are both death, and their symbol is myrrh. And so when we find in the New Testament that Jesus is presented with gold and frankincense and myrrh, we know beyond any doubt whatsoever that the early writers are telling us here is an important senior king of this royal bloodline, because nobody else would ever be presented with those things. Just a couple of things, because I'm not sure who's here tonight. At the end of my talk last October, I was asked a couple of questions, and I said I would respond to them this time around. I was asked whether the Egyptian Ankh was related to the female fertility symbol, the cross surmounted by the circle, whether they were related to the Rosicrucis, the cross within the circle. And the answer to that is yes. And they're also further related to the orb, the sovereign emblem, the circle below the cross, the orb of sovereignty. They are all the same mark. The Ouroboros, the circle, is always the symbol of wholeness, and the cross simply determines whether it's male, female, whether it's unity, if it's in the central or whatever. I was also asked whether the starfire custom, the taking of this blood, the ritual of the menstrual starfire, had anything to do with voodoo, whether the voodoo rituals of the Caribbean and Africa came from this root. And the answer to that is indirectly, very indirectly, but yes, they did in a way. It was always known that blood was a vehicle of the spirits. They knew that from the earliest times. But in the non-scientific, non-academic centers of these African regions, what they didn't quite get into their heads was that this was personal spirit it was about, not about manifesting spirits. So the blood rituals of the voodoo people are about manifesting spirits rather than the physical evolvement of one's own spirit. So it's different, but the root's the same. Starfire was the gold of the gods. It was fed to the Messianic kings. It became supplemented by the white powder of gold or by other metals. And this moved from Mesopotamia into Egypt. It is the reason why the pharaohs were said to have divine powers, were said to move in the realm of the gods. They clearly did. They were taking this stuff and being fed to it. Metallurgists are interesting. In the New Testament, we're told that Joseph, Jesus' father, was a carpenter, aren't we? And I mentioned in Bloodline and in my previous talks that actually what it said was that he was a master craftsman. Now, we have a whole new connotation on that now, because the master craftsmen are indeed the people who ran the temples, who were in charge of the production of the white powder of gold. We know now that this was exactly what they were doing in the Essene environment at Qumran, and we now know that Jesus' father himself was a master craftsman, and the master craftsmen, the leaders of these temples, were called masters. Now it's interesting to note as you go through the gospel stories that you come to a point in all of them where suddenly Jesus, who's previously been called teacher or rabbi or whatever, is suddenly called master. That comes soon after the point where his father dies, so it's perfectly apparent that now he is the master craftsman. He himself has taken the degrees and become a Vulcan, and suddenly we can understand what these degrees were about that he was taking at the temple when he stayed behind and he was 12 years old and they had to come and look for him. What were these degrees? They were degrees of alchemy. So, Highwood Firestone, Shemana, or as the Jews called it, simply manna, which meant what is it? They weren't sure what it was. The period of the switch is interesting. When the starfire disappeared and the white powder came in, not only turns up in historical record, it's given to us in the Bible at a period of a guy called Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek's statue, the Knights Templars put at Chartres Cathedral in France, and it is incredibly upfront in what it says to us. In that statue, Melchizedek is presenting the chalice of the wine of the blood, but lo and behold, there is no wine or blood in it, simply a stone or a piece of bread. And that actually marks the time, and that fits in identically with the records round about 1960 BC, when the wine, the blood, ritual disappeared and it was taken over by the bread, the production of the Shemana, the firestone, the white powder of gold. Is actually said in the New Testament book of Revelation, to him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone. In the Middle Age Grail romance of the Temple Knights of Grail Castle, it says, they live by virtue of a stone most pure. If you don't know its name, it is called lapis exilis. By the power of the stone, the phoenix is burned to ashes, but the ashes speedily restore it to life. The phoenix therefore molts, and thereupon gives out a bright light, so that it is as beautiful as before. Now, the key to this is in the fact that the phoenix is burned to ashes. And from those ashes, says the legend, comes the great enlightenment, the great fire, as the phoenix is born again. So what is the phoenix? Well, we're told it's a bird. The phoenix was never a bird. That comes from a very different form of Bennu bird mythology. Phoenix was a Phoenician Greek word, and it means red gold. An Alexandrian text, an old text, actually states this. When the paradise stone is placed on the scales, the stone can outweigh its own quantity of gold. But when it is covered to dust, even a feather will tip the scales against it. Now that's interesting, isn't it? What is it that can outweigh its own volume of gold, but that can also be lighter than itself when it's a dust, a powder? This links up with the phoenix that burns to ashes, the red gold that burns to ashes. And from those ashes comes the bright enlightenment as it's born again, bigger and richer than it ever was before. This is the story of the Shemana, the Highwood Firestone, the gold, the metal that is burned to a powder, and from it comes the great enlightenment. We're told that a lot of metals weren't discovered until the 1840s. Platinum group metals like ruthenium and osmium and iridium, ruthenium, all of these metals were known about 4,000-5,000 years ago. We simply didn't name them until the 1840s. So these kings were purpose-bred. They were purpose-bred to be the purveyors of light, and they were defined as the sons of the gods. When we now read the early texts of the New Testament anew, we come across something really interesting. Because within the Bible, just about all the plural uses of the word God, gods, has been turned into God. Jesus was described as a son of the gods. Hence, we have this terrible dilemma about whether he was really the Son of God or whether he wasn't the Son of God or who God was, whether that was Jehovah. None of that makes any difference at all. He was a purpose-bred king of the line, a purveyor of the light, a son of the gods. And he became a master. He was fed by the Essenes on the same high-spin shamana, the Grail substitute, the starfire substitute. In fact, that's an interesting thing. Starfire in ancient Sumerian is spelt G-R-A-A-L. Grail. Grail. It's exactly the same thing. So we have really not much of a mystery left with Jesus, do we? I mean, we can actually say the Bible's right. We don't have to debate it anymore. Yes, he was a son of the gods. He was also the son of a physical person because he had to be born in that bloodline. But what we now know is why Mary was so important. Mary was the holder of the mitochondrial DNA. And stunningly, when we follow Mary's genealogy back, she is of no Jewish descent at all. She comes out of the great kings of Egypt. So her line is immensely important. We ran over time in the first half, so I think, although I'm a few pages from where I thought I'd get to, it's a good place to stop now, I think, because you've probably got some questions and things. I could go on forever, but let's hear what you want to hear.
I have a short question. It is about your time schedule is always... You place the beginning of civilizations about 3,800 years ago, or 3,800. And nevertheless, there has been shown by some geological evidences that the Great Pyramids, which would be the time of Hermes, following your, what you have said, cannot be younger than... I don't remember, by the kind of 10,000 years before BC or so. Do you know anything about that, or you are completely in line with the general chronology of ancient history that we give in the Bible and all that?
Right. The 3,800 BC, the 4,000 BC, that aspect of what I'm talking about, don't confuse this, please, with my seemingly saying this was the beginning of civilization. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is this is the beginning of the creation of earthly kingship. It's a different thing. The human story, the story of the Anunnaki and everything that went before has a much, much longer time span. But it was in that period where the documents appear that tell us about how the kingly race was determined and devised. And that's really what I'm interested in, how this line of kings happened to be. As far as the pyramids are concerned, I have come across no evidence whatever, anywhere, that suggests that the pyramids were not physically built in the time frame of the 4th dynasty pharaohs. However, there is amazing evidence to show that their ground plans were laid down probably 10,000 years before that. So the ground plans I see as a different thing to the actual physical building of the temples, because they were built for these specific kings in any event. But ground plan, I mean, geological surveys and things have shown them to be really very, very old. People like Graham Hancock and others are writing about this all the time, and they're doing some very good research in this field.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I missed the first part of his question, but my question is, do you have any information which might indicate any ancestry to Adam and Eve, since you mentioned they were near gods and the first earthly kings?
Yep. Well, I don't have it, but the ancient Sumerians wrote it down. This is House of Shimty Creation Chamber Project. The story of Adam and Eve is laid down not only as an inclination, but in great and very thorough detail about how these people were bred. The interesting thing about it is that it throws the sequence of the flood out of its biblical chronology, in as much as that the story of the creation of Adam and Eve as told by the Mesopotamians themselves happened after the flood, not before the flood. The story tells us that Anu gave the directive that a kingly race had to be developed, that these people, the contrived people who they called Lulu, man, Lulu actually it simply means one that is mixed, so even mankind at that time was determined as being Lulu, one that is mixed. It was a hybrid, it was a created race in its Homo sapien state, the thinking man, the wise man. But the kingly race had to be evolved, and the only way to make that race different was to give it more and more of the Anunnaki blood. And so the story is quite simply about how Adam and Eve were created by Enki, who was at that time called the Lord, and his wife Ninhursag, his sister, who was called the Lady of the Embryo. And the story is going to great lengths to tell us how these embryo were created by fertilizing the ova of Earth women and reimplanting it back in Ninhursag's own womb and whatever. So, yeah, I mean, if Adam and Eve had parents, they had three parents. They had Enki, they had Ninhursag, and they had an earthly woman who actually produced the egg that bore them.
I have a question. Oops. Okay. Thanks. I have a question about manna and how it's mentioned in the Old Testament, and the fact that when the Jews came into the desert after the splitting of the Red Sea, and they didn't have any food to eat, they were given manna, which came from, I guess, the sky, and it could be anything that they wanted it to be, and they could eat it, and if I remember correctly, it was white, and they couldn't put anything away because whatever they would put away, it would spoil, but they could only take whatever they needed and eat that. Was this, you mentioned this in parallel, is this the same as the white powder?
No.
No, okay.
It's given to us as if it is. The way that the story is told to us, it's the way the word manna is used very carefully that confuses the issue, because manna in the Hebrew simply meant, what is it? It was something that they didn't know what it was, and the Bible says something like, they said to Moses, what is it? It must be manna because we don't know what it is, and he said, we'll call it bread. And then it switches from that quite slickly and very cleverly into Moses burning the calf that was made of gold and turning it into a powder. This is a wholly different story. Now, manna is described, the original manna that fell on the ground around them and that they ate and was called bread at that stage, you can actually find today if you go to the region. You can actually go there and find it. It happens at a particular time of the evening. There is a little worm that attacks the tamarisk plant. And at a particular time of the evening, this plant will just throw off into the air these tiny little sweet honey-like beads of white. Looks like small coriander seed, and it just settles on the ground all around. Now, that is exactly the definition that's given to us in the book of Exodus. It describes that perfectly. Now, that you can actually live off for weeks. Eat it forever. I mean, it's a wonderful food, but the problem is with it, it's got a life of about 2 or 3 hours. If you don't get it immediately, it's done for, because this worm thing just keeps on working at it. So what happens is that that's called manna, and then suddenly the white powder made from the gold appears, and that's called manna as well. But that wasn't fed to all and sundry for 40 years in the wilderness. That was a different thing. It was fed to them just once so that they could see the effect that it had on them. And then from then on, the story goes on, and that's simply held within the kingly line. And it doesn't matter where you look in the Old Testament, it's suddenly called showbread. It tells us how to make showbread. You take the white powder, you mix it with frankincense, you break it into little conical cakes, and you call it showbread. And this was restricted specifically for the high priests and the kings, and even the Bible tells us that.
Thank you.
Greetings.
Hello.
Would you please clarify or specify the lineage a little more of Moses and his origins as far as bloodlines? I've got a lot of mixed information that have come in. You know, he was a father, or the Pharaoh was a father, or he was come down the river, or who was a mother, and that. Can you clarify that, and who and what names, please?
Let me just read you something. I had it here, but didn't get into it. Listen to this. Think of Moses. This is just a statement from an old document. My changeling mother conceived me. In secret, she bare me, but she set me aside in a basket of rushes. She sealed my lid with pitch, and she cast me and it into the river. But the river rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Akkad, and Akkad was the drawer of the water. Now that is pretty well the story that we get told about the birth of Moses in the Bible. Drawer of the water was the title of Akkad in this story, and we are told in the Bible that the Pharaoh called the baby Moses because she drew him out of the water. Well, the word Moses in Hebrew or Egyptian or anywhere didn't have that meaning. It never did. This was related to the story of Akkad and the person who was set in the basket of rushes and who in a historical context went through this story. That is the story written down in person by Sargon the Great, king of Akkad in 2370 BC, 1,000 years before the time of Moses, and he, then known as Sharukin, was telling the story of his own childhood and how he came to be found and became the king, the great leader. Now, the chances are that even that in itself was mythology, but it doesn't matter. It is a perfect example of how certain stories that were Mesopotamian in origin or even early Egyptian in origin were taken on board by Bible writers and used to create a mythology around their own characters. The story that revolves around the Moses story in the Bible about the Pharaoh issuing this dictate that all the children under the age from the Israelites should be slain and whatever. We get exactly that same story in the New Testament. It comes up again, only this time it's King Herod, and it's Jesus, not Moses, that is at the end of this dictate. So Moses' story, as we're given it in the Bible, is simply that little bit, the Ark of Rushes. He has a sister, the sister's called Miriam. The Pharaoh's daughter comes along, and she gives the boy back to his own mother, who brings him up, and all of a sudden, this dictate of the Pharaoh seems to have no effect at all, because the boy is right back where he was in the first place before he was hidden in the rushes, and yet he's not killed by the Pharaoh, which was actually what the story was based on to start with. It's a pure piece of mythology. One verse in the Bible after this story is told Moses is a grown man. We have no story of him in between at all, but what we actually have in Exodus is something very interesting and which no writer has ever been able to get around, and it tells us quite firmly that Moses was an Egyptian. Says it. Moses was an Egyptian. That was why the Israelites had a bit of a problem with him. That was why, when he took them back into the other country, they still had to implement all of these Egyptian rules and hymns and things. So in fact, what they were doing was not converting the Israelites to the Hebrew culture. They were inflicting the Egyptian culture on the Israelites and the Hebrews in that country. The story of Moses is a very long one. It's often said by writers that although Moses was supposed to be very important and big as a governor and a ruler in the land of Egypt, that the Egyptian records make no mention of him. Actually, they do, and by that name. Not until fairly late in the day, but in about 400 BC, the Egyptian writers of history recorded him as an Egyptian who was trained as a priest at Heliopolis and who ultimately became a pharaoh. And the pharaoh that Moses became, remember the name Moses actually means heir of. Most of the Egyptian pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were called Moses, Tuthmoses, Amenmoses, born of Toth, born of Amen, that sort of thing. Moses was actually Pharaoh Akhenaten. His sister, Merikir, beloved of the goddess Kiba, Mary, in Hebrew, is Miriam. So that's the story. I mean, it's something I deal with actually at great length in the book, the family history, but Akhenaten and Moses are absolutely identical.
Would you say that again? What was that? That last words you...
Sorry?
You said something at the end I missed that was important.
Just now, I said something.
Yeah,
what I said was that Moses and Akhenaten were identical, Merikea and Miriam were identical, and this is the importance of the book of Jasher that was missed out of the Bible. The story of Miriam in the book of Jasher is quite something. She, of course, held the DNA of the royal bloodline. She was the important person. The story is told that it was Miriam who led the Israelites out of Egypt. It was Miriam who was the great advisor even to the Hebrews then who were already in Canaan. And it was Miriam whom they mourned for years and years after her death. And the story is quite astonishing. Miriam in the Old Testament suffers from exactly what Mary Magdalene suffered from in the New Testament. If her story was told, it would be very easy to understand the whole of how it worked through the female line, but she got pushed aside as a little lady with a tambourine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome back. I actually have two questions, so if one of them is addressed in your book, then I'd like the other one to be responded to, or if you would take the first one. You've mentioned mitochondrial DNA, and I'm interested in more information about that, and if you've encountered any information relating that and 12-strand DNA. And the second question is regarding the tables of testimony that you've been speaking of today. And I'm wondering if there's a connection between those and what you were speaking of when you were here a year ago and mentioned that we're still in the hands of the royal houses of Europe. And the information would be revealed at an appropriate time, and I'm wondering if that time has arrived.
Wow. Yes, in the current work, I'm generally referring to these documents as the tables of destiny, whereas previously you'll remember, have talked about the tables of testimony. Now, in essence, they are exactly the same thing. The difference is in the culture that's referring to them. Once one gets back into the BC years and into old time, they're always called the tables of destiny. Once one comes into the Christian era and modern times, they're called the tables of testimony. It's exactly the same thing. And in fact, the story of them goes back the longest time. I mean, the Mesopotamian records tell us who the guardians of these tables were, one by one, within the Anunnaki family strains. And they were regarded as the ultimate treasures of kingships and Anunnaki control. Aspects of the tables of testimony actually moved into the early Kabbalah, Hebrew Kabbalah. And Kabbalah itself is an interesting history because it's often presumed that the early Kabbalah with a Q was the same as the later Kabbalah with a K or a C, and it actually was not. They were different things entirely with a different history, and they have different roots even today. And the organizations that are involved in them right now will tell you that this has nothing to do with that. Kabbalah and the Kabbalists are very different things. Yes, the time is now, but that doesn't mean to say it's this week or today or even this year. In the course of the way history moves, 300 years is a moment in time. What's happening is that we are now at the moment in time in the larger scheme of things where knowledge is beginning to come to the fore by one route or another. I'm not the person fronting this by any means. I'm just a little part of it. You know, I get bits of it from here and there, and other people are doing their bits, and gradually we can see that we are in an age of great enlightenment. Things like computers and the internet cause us to be questioners today. We were never questioners before. Until people learn to answer questions, to ask questions, or to challenge the dogmas, then there's no way that the secrets and mysteries will ever be revealed because people aren't ready for them. Right now, people are ready. So little by little, yeah, things are coming to light. It doesn't mean to say that when I go back to Britain, I open a cupboard up and there are the tables of testimony. It doesn't sort of work like that. But But the translated forms of them do exist in numerous languages, and certainly within orders like the Imperial Order of the Dragon. I mean, they've got amazing records of this stuff going right back to Egyptian times. The other question, DNA, I have to be very careful when I write things in a book of this sort that I don't present myself at any moment in time as looking like a doctor or a scientist or a medical man, because I'm none of these things. I can only report on findings as they are at the moment, or on information passed to me by doctors or medical men. What I knew from the research was that there was clearly a very important DNA that was only managed through the female strain. And so this is where the mitochondrial strain comes from. You know, this is the key form of DNA that is passed to offspring from mothers. Fathers don't have a part in this. Doesn't mean it only goes to daughters, it goes to sons and daughters, but then again, only the mother passes it on to the next generation. So without me personally knowing too much about the mechanics of it as a doctor, historically, that was what they were about, perpetuating the bloodline through that DNA strain. Yeah?
Thank you very much for your profound research.
Yeah.
The powder at the Egyptian temple, did you happen across any records for its creation?
Sorry, did I?
Did you happen across any records for the creation of the white powder at the Egyptian temples?
Did I come across any records for the creation of it? You mean, how do we do it? Well, I would watch David Hudson's video. That pretty well tells you how to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's... I would never, from the records, have known how to do it. Like all alchemical records, they're written in a very veiled form. They talk about furnaces and they talk about lightning. Well, today we talk about DC arcs and things, and suddenly lightning has a different meaning, you know. So you'd never know just from the records how to do this stuff, but by lining it up with what people are doing today and the experiments that are going on now, suddenly it does fall into place, and you can look back at the old records and say, yeah, that's what they meant. They talk about glass manufacture. Now, in Egypt, they had a form of glass manufacture which was identical to what they used in the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. Now, the construction of this glass is actually detailed quite thoroughly, and it was a particular form of glass that was made out of metals. Now, the interesting thing about it is that it defines within the process of making this glass, and they said that the different metals determine the coloration, that during the course of the manufacture of the glass, its weight changed dramatically from the metal that it started with. Now, if you watch the David Hudson videos, he explains that what happens is that you retain a 56% optimum weight and 46% of it just disappears and nobody knows where it goes. He determines that this is pure light, and when it comes back, it's returned as pure light. Now, what the documents say is that when the glass is made and the glass is installed, the light of the sun causes the spiritus mundi to return. Now, the spiritus mundi was actually called the breath of the universe. The breath of the universe was light, pure, bright, white light. So what they were really saying is that the moment they perfected this technique and made the glass, back comes the 44%. It's light, and it's there. And that's exactly what David Hudson describes in his experiments. So without him, I would never have understood what those things meant. But linking the two together, suddenly it gels.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Sir Laurence, I'm interested in the link between this bloodline that you speak of and you've written so much about and researched, and the relationship to the European Council of Princes for whom you work. Is there, it appears to me that that the bringing back of perhaps constitutional monarchies is something that's of great interest to you. And I'd like to know, is that accurate? And secondly, is there a link somehow with bringing this particular genetic line back?
Indirectly. I mean, it's not a specific agenda of any sort. you know, if one reads aspects of books like The Holy Blood and The Holy Grail and whatever, you get this feeling that there's a sort of an undercurrent of some secret network of people trying to bring this back or that back. That's exactly what it isn't. There are very, very few secrets or bits of knowledge that appear to us today to be new that haven't been there to have all the time. These people have never been slow to tell the story, and they've never withheld information. It's the people that get in between the church establishments, the governmental establishments, that put the blocks on things and stop this getting through. And if it does, they call it mythology. At worst, they call it witchcraft and heresy and all of that. So really what's happening now is that people are suddenly seeing these things in a new light when they're presented. And they're saying, hey, this is not witchcraft, this is scientific, this is interesting. As far as the royal families are concerned, you have to accept the fact that royal lines come from all sorts of places. There are, within the current royal houses, very clean, very direct lines, but there are others that are very diluted and come from round the edges and whatever. At the end of it, what the council is concerned about, as against what I'm concerned about, they're concerned about an attitude, a princely code of contact, an attitude towards service by princes to the people. Now, it's perfectly possible for somebody to have all of these attributes without being of the bloodline at all, or at least not knowing that she were. So the Council of Princes is not a group of people who are attempting to bring themselves back as the great Grail Kings of the world. It's not like that. I mean, in fact, they're a very low-key sort of council. They just mediate between governments and the Constitution and that sort of thing, and half the time, governments take no notice of them at all. They have to take notice of them when they're quoting the Constitutions, that's all, so that governments can't bypass them with legislation that is contrary to what's laid down. But it's not just those families. You know, in Britain, we had old kingdoms in the Dark Ages, the pre-King Arthur times, the era of the Pictish kingdoms and the old Celtic rulers and all of that. Most of those families today still know who they are. They still know who they are. They still have their courts. Some of them even have their own armies around them. They're not armed armies, but the titles, the structures still exist. So that if, for example, you know, a particular little area of northern England happened to get its independence, then these people could naturally just assume a sort of governor status within that. It's not something that everybody sort of waves banners around and takes that seriously, but quite clearly these families are terribly, terribly proud of their heritage. And they are very, very concerned that when a line was purpose-bred by scientific means to do a job, that gradually, little bit by little throughout history, they have been maneuvered aside and pushed aside for church-controlled merchant classes to take over government. And therein lies an interesting story, because once you see that happening country by country and see the way that governmental structure changes after it, you can actually see that there was a positive difference between the line that was bred to be kings and the line that proclaimed itself kings. And the whole aptitude and attitude towards the whole thing was quite different. That's kind of what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a proper constitutional structure with constitutions that belonged to people, were not subjected to amendment at will by governments and parliaments, so that the people's champion was always the monarch and the constitution, and parliament simply operated alongside that and did what they were allowed to do by the people who make the choices.
Thank you.
Hi, Laurence.
Hello.
I'm so glad I've been watching your videos for about 8 months now, or I wouldn't know what you're talking about. I just watch those so much in the evening, and they're so great. Kind of a thought just came to me. I grew up in the rubber capital of the world, Akron, Ohio. And I know that there is a term called vulcanization having to do with rubber. I also know that the hierarchy were called the dynasties, and one of the great ones is Firestone.
Isn't it? Interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, I mean, it's for no chance reason sometimes that names get chosen for products. In ancient Persia, the The god of light was Mazda or Osram. Now in Britain we have our two leading light bulbs are called Mazda and Osram. You know, these names crop up time and time again, and we take little notice of it. Firestone, of course, for tires. Vulcanization, of course. This is the power of molding. Hermetically sealed glass. Here's another one. That comes straight out of ancient Egypt when they're creating vacuums between sheets of glass, using the emerald tablet of Hermes and the information within it. It was hermetic. So today we get this sealed double glazing and we call it hermetically sealed. It's from exactly that same root. So yeah, it all comes from the same root source.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There you go.